Mark pointed out that I've now been given the title of Professor Emeritus, and we have a standard comment that's made on that status when it says someone has been conferred a position as Professor Emeritus. The Berkeley professors all say, yes, it's an honor he should have had many years ago. I'm always glad to be back here in Washington for a visit, particularly a brief visit if it's during the hot weather. It's awfully good to see the air conditioning working. Fortunately, we have cooler weather in the San Francisco area, and that is very fortunate because we don't have any electricity anymore for air conditioning. So you can be thankful for that. I sometimes think that air conditioning is what spelled the inevitable doom of the United States of America, however, because it is air conditioning that made it possible to keep Washington, D.C. open all year. So we have to live with the consequences of that. Now, lots of exciting things happen in Washington, as you know, and one of them was last June 26, just a year ago, June 26, 2000, when President Clinton called a press conference to announce that the scientific effort to sequence the human genome had met with substantial success. Exactly how much success is a matter of continuing debate, but on this occasion the atmosphere was triumphalistic, that it was being announced that a great breakthrough had been made in understanding the basic biochemistry of the human body and mind, the human genome. So, as you'll recall, they brought together the rival groups that had been trying to complete this work, Craig Venter and his corporation for the private effort, and then Dr. Francis Collins, the director of the government's Human Genome Project, representing the government scientists, and they pretended to be very friendly and congratulating each other and so on. Much like the Senators Daschle and Trent Lott pictures more recently. There had been quite a bitter rivalry. Now, it was fascinating to me to see how this triumph was announced, because here are the words that President Clinton used to announce this scientific triumph. He said, "Today we are learning the language in which God created life. We are gaining ever more awe for the complexity, the beauty, the wonder of God's most divine and sacred gift." I had to wonder, what are the scientists in the audience thinking when he says this? He says, we are learning the language in which God created life. Now, that, in a nutshell, is the intelligent design position, a position that I've been advocating with my colleagues and that has received such bitter resistance from the scientific and intellectual community. That is, to put it in a few more words, the DNA contains a code, and in the code are written instructions which direct the construction and folding of proteins, which are a very important part of the life process. These instructions are complex, and so you can analogize the DNA to some type of a program which is directing these difficult and complicated operations. The program is written in a language, and we think of instructions written in language, we naturally think of an author of the instructions. So it's sort of a common sense position to say there is evidence of intelligence in the DNA instructions. Common sense, but controversial. Now, that was President Clinton, and of course he's a politician, not a scientist. And moreover, not everyone believes everything that he says. However, there was also Dr. Francis Collins, the director of the Human Genome Project, who is a very distinguished scientist with no credibility problems that I'm aware of. Certainly no special prosecutors have been appointed or anything like that. And he used very similar words, saying, and I quote his exact words, "It is humbling for me and awe-inspiring to realize that we have caught the first glimpse of our own instruction book, previously known only to God." You see, so there's the language again, instruction book. Now, the press didn't make anything about these comments, interestingly enough, as if they had said something controversial or whatever. And perhaps that was because in the minds of the reporters or perhaps of the scientists present, this is ceremonial language. And that would be a question to be raised. Is this just ceremonial language reflecting a sort of popular piety? Or is it rather a sensible explanation, a sensible interpretation of what the scientific evidence is actually showing? Well, now, of course, there were other interpretations, other things that were said. Dr. Craig Venter, the head of the private corporation's efforts to sequence the genome, put it this way in his own words. Said, one of the wonderful discoveries that my colleagues and I have made while decoding the DNA of over 24 species, from viruses to bacteria to plants to insects and now human beings, is that we are all connected to the commonality of the genetic code and evolution. Now, does that contradict what Clinton and Collins said? We're all connected to the commonality of the genetic code and evolution. Well, probably it doesn't, logically, but the message now is a bit different, that it's the commonality of life. You see, we're all connected to the other kinds of life. Now, that point was made also by perhaps the most influential biologist of the present time, Dr. David Baltimore, the Nobel Prize-winning biochemist who's president of Caltech, who wrote in the New York Times that the Genome Project had revealed that our genes look very much like those of fruit flies, worms, and even plants. This implies that we are all descended from the same humble beginnings, which Baltimore thought should be but won't be the end of creationism. See, now, our genes are like those of worms, fruit flies, and plants. We're connected to the rest of life. We're all descended from the same humble beginnings, and that should be, but won't be, the end of creationism. Now, see, isn't this something to take note of? That on the one hand, you have the head of the government's Genome Project saying, we're learning to read the instruction book, previously known only to God, and we have another distinguished biologist saying, well, this should be, but won't be, the end of creationism. See, that is creationism, what Dr. Collins said, that there is a creator who is responsible for this language. Now, as I say, the reporters didn't draw attention to this difference, but one genome scientist who was involved in the sequencing wrote to the New York Times and said that President Clinton's references to God could not be further from the truth, and that they would only give more ammunition to creationists to further their destructive social and political agenda. See, so he shouldn't say things like that because it's not true, and it will encourage these creationists to further their unspecified, destructive social and political agenda. Well, that again should cause people, I think, to prick up their ears a bit, because it sounds as if there are serious political issues involved in this. You see, that's what he's saying. And once you see that a scientific viewpoint is being defended on the grounds it's necessary to protect us against somebody's destructive political aims, something more than science is quite obviously at work. Now, to add just one more quote on this, a reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper did get very interested in this subject. What is the genome showing? And now, this was quite an amazing place to find this, because if you know something about San Francisco, you may know it's not their major newspaper is not exactly an organ of the religious right. This reporter came out and interviewed the people involved in the Genome Project, and he quoted one Eugene Myers, a computer scientist who was instrumental in the Craig Venter private corporation effort to sequence the genome. And what he told this reporter was, what really astounds me is the architecture of life. The system is extremely complex. It's like it was designed. There's a huge intelligence there. I don't see that as being unscientific. Others may, not me. Well, there's a man who, as much as anyone else, instrumental in the actual sequencing work. There's a huge intelligence there. I don't see that as being unscientific. So you have the potential here for a very interesting and possibly fruitful intellectual debate. Francis Collins and President Clinton and Gene Myers said the most reasonable way to interpret what is going on, or at least a reasonable way, Or is the way that Dr. David Baltimore and this scientist who wrote to the New York Times, the only reasonable way? Should this be the end of the idea of supernatural divine creation, that the genome has been sequenced, or is it the beginning of that? Should it give a shot in the arm, a new life to that idea? There doesn't seem to be any way of carrying out that discussion in the public debate. You see, it is passed over. And we know that this is an issue that greatly interests the American public. All the polls show that. The public is overwhelmingly on the side of believing in the reality of a creator. Only 10% of the public, according to public opinion polls that are consistent over the last 30 years, agrees with the mainstream dominant scientific view that human beings and all other living things were created by a purely natural process of evolution that is unguided and purposeless. And yet there seems to be great difficulty in presenting this issue as something that one could debate and argue about on the evidence. Now, there's a little bit more to this, too. I want to go back to that press conference and to President Clinton's words, because he said something else that was also very interesting. He took note of the fact that there are grave ethical problems raised by the scientific knowledge that's coming out of the Genome Project in particular and molecular biology in general. And you all know that. There's the cover stories in the news magazines about cloning. Should it be illegal? Most people seem to conclude it should, but they also seem to conclude that there's nothing much we can do to stop it. That if somebody's determined to do it, cloning a human being is going to be tried. It's not as well publicized, but not really secret, that many scientists involved in human genome work dream of the day when they will be able to design better people. They redesign the whole genome to get better people more like themselves, presumably. And this raises many ethical issues of how or whether this should be applied. On the other hand, there's a great promise that isn't very controversial at all of possibly curing genetic diseases like cystic fibrosis. That's what Dr. Collins would love to do. He discovered, as I recall, the cystic fibrosis gene, but it was discovered some years ago, and there's been no progress towards a cure, so no one knows when or if that will happen. But perhaps most immediately, there's a lot of concern that information about your genome, information about your genes, might be used for your detriment. You might find yourself uninsurable, unable to get medical insurance, or unemployable or whatever due to bad genes. President Clinton addressed that concern, and he said, as we consider how to use new discoveries, we must also not retreat from our oldest and most cherished human values. And what is this? He said specifically, all of us are created equal, entitled to equal treatment under the law. Well, now, you know where that language comes from. The traditions of the country, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and so on. We're created equal, all human beings equal under the law. But is that actually so? See, in the university world where I live, in fact, it tends more to be taken for granted that we are not created equal or otherwise. Rather, we are the process of a blind process of evolution that doesn't care about us and that doesn't give any special status to human beings. And in fact, there are tangible consequences of this belief. Animal rights movements, for example. And it is very common in philosophical circles to refer to the belief that there is anything particularly special about human beings as speciesism. Say, speciesism is a sort of thought crime that is the next step in the line from racism, sexism, and homophobia. So if you're thinking that we are created equal and superior, or special from other things, this has now become a controversial proposition. And you can see the philosophical basis for that, can't you, in the remark I quoted by Dr. David Baltimore, that eminent spokesman for the biological community. Our genes look very much like those of fruit flies, worms, and even plants. Now, when you understand that the biological doctrine around that is that the genes are then what dictate the characteristics of the person, you might say we are all like fruit flies, worms, and even plants. So if you're going to ask what we're created equal to, there's a possible answer. So what I'm illustrating here is there's clearly a moral dimension to this whole argument. There are moral questions in the air. And how are they going to be addressed? How are they going to be decided? Is there something sacred about the genome? Is there something sacred about humans as opposed to animals? Or are we all part of that continuity of life? It's an important question. I'm not preaching an answer to it here so much as saying that this is another matter which eminently deserves public understanding and debate. And yet, it has been very difficult to address. And now, why? Well, we have a vocabulary and a set of ideas that has essentially decided these questions in the definitions. If we had Dr. Baltimore and his colleagues here and I said, would you agree that there's scientific evidence for an instruction book authored by God? I'm quite sure he would say that is preposterous. Of course there is not, just as that scientist who wrote to the New York Times said, that couldn't be farther from the truth. Now, the reason for that, or the ultimate reason, if not the only reason, is that in our culture, science is defined as an activity which is directed to giving an explanation of every phenomena in the world in terms of natural causes and natural causes only. Guidelines for science teachers that come down ultimately from the scientific authorities at the National Academy of Sciences say this explicitly. A scientific explanation is an explanation in terms of natural causes and natural causes alone. Therefore, there cannot possibly be scientific evidence that points to the existence of something supernatural. It's a contradiction in terms. And that, I think, would lead any person holding this philosophical viewpoint, this metaphysical idea of how things are, to interpret what President Clinton and Dr. Collins said as essentially ceremonial language. We aren't going to make a fuss about it because at moments like this, naturally the politicians are supposed to say whatever is necessary to get the taxpayers to foot the bill. And if they like to hear God talk, you give them God talk. But there would be no more meaning to it than that. Now, one can see this kind of an idea operating if you also look at an article that interested me a great deal that appeared in Scientific American magazine a couple of years ago, which was a profile of Dr. Francis Collins. Of this press conference, and Dr. Collins is fairly well known as an out-of-the-closet evangelical Christian. And outspoken person in that regard. Very unusual to find in that high a position in the scientific establishment, particularly in biology, which tends to be very strongly materialist in philosophy. Dr. Collins is an exception. So when Scientific American wrote a profile of him, do you know what the subtitle was? Dr. Francis Collins struggles to keep his religion from interfering with his science or his politics. And so that was the theme of the whole thing. And it was clearly implying, I'm sure they thought it was an exercise in tolerance. Look how tolerant we are. We'll say something nice about this fellow. But the message was that he was acceptable as long as he struggled to make sure that his science was not affected by this odd religion that he had. Now, you might have thought that he crossed that boundary. But I think probably the ceremonial language exception saved him on that occasion. It would be entirely different if Dr. Collins were to attend a scientific meeting and present a paper, publish it in publications of the National Academy of Sciences, saying that the complex specified information contained in the genome points to the need to consider the reality of an intelligent source, that is to say a designer, that is to say a creator. If he were to say that, the reaction would be fierce. His position would be very much endangered. You see, so there is a philosophical doctrine working here, which makes it virtually impossible to ask the question in a decent public forum. We'll do it here anyway, at the risk of indecency. Makes it almost impossible to ask the question, is what Dr. Collins says true? You say, is it a reasonable inference from the evidence? Science is committed to a naturalistic understanding of things. Now, what that means is that when the American public asks the question, as they frequently do, now wait a minute, what are you people saying? You say, are you saying that God didn't do the creating, or how do you know that you didn't need to have a creator to supply that genetic information? The scientific community wants to answer a different question. You say, which is, by what philosophical doctrine do you like to approach these questions? What assumptions do you like to make? How do you like to define your enterprise? And then, so the answer is, well, as scientists, we, of course, assume that adequacy of natural causes to account for everything, and so we assume that this genome, whatever its characteristics may have been, was molded like everything else in life by the material processes of random mutation and natural selection, and that's how it came about. And if you ask, well, but is that really true? The answer is, well, it's science. Okay, that's how we do it in science. That is our scientific answer. And that means it's fact. So it is effectively true because science is the ultimate authority on these matters. Now, notice that there's also another question that it makes really rather difficult to answer. Well, what are we to make of President Clinton's statement that we are to rely for our ethical protection from some possibly unethical application of this technology in the doctrine that we are created equal and hence entitled to equal protection of the law? Are we relying on a false doctrine? On a pious myth that has now been discredited? If so, it doesn't sound like we have very much protection at all. To put it more generally, what is going to be the foundation for any cultural discussion, any cultural rulemaking, having to do with the difference between right and wrong? Not questions of what we can do, but questions of what we should do. What knowledge would illuminate that? Well, if our only guide is science, you see, then the question is, what can we do? And that is indeed why many people, including me, suspect that as anything that can be done will be done. And that all talk of ethical protections or whatever is just so much of a smokescreen because there's no way to develop a basis of knowledge as to what is right and wrong in that area. Well, I went through this story to illustrate to you how much of a live conversation this is, how much of a, in the news topic. It's no wonder that we fill lecture halls all the time whenever this subject is announced. It's no wonder that the public has such a fascination with it. People really want to know. Is there evidence for a creator, or is that an outdated idea? Now, I think the biggest barrier to having a serious consideration of this has been, and has long been, the idea that if you raise the question of where science is going, whether the scientific evidence is pointing to a creator or away from a creator, our culture again defines this question as a Bible versus science debate. And say, which are you going to believe, the Bible or science? And in our culture, the Bible versus science translates pretty quickly into the Bible versus the facts. So it's a bit reminiscent of that wonderful scene in the Groucho Marx movie where he is caught in flagrante delicto by Margaret Dumont, and he says to her, well, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? Who are you going to believe, the Bible or the facts, is something on that level as a question. So if we're going to have any kind of a public dialogue and public understanding of these issues, we need a vocabulary and we need a set of concepts that enables the real controversial questions to be put on the table, to be decided. And so that's what we've tried to do in the intelligent design movement. That's how we've been trying to achieve the breakthrough, as the title of my lecture tonight describes as coming. So I'm going to tell you first how we're trying to achieve the breakthrough, and then why I believe that it is coming, that is going to be the most exciting intellectual issue of the early 21st century. Now, what we have attempted to do is to reformulate the debate so that intelligent things can be said about it. Okay, so that you get away from stereotype debates such as the Genesis versus geology a kind of debate that isn't going anywhere, and ask a question that's more fundamental and much more accessible to scientific investigation and discussion. What about it? Does the evidence of life point to the need for what we call intelligent sources, intelligent causes, a designer, some type of intelligence that is affecting life, or does it tend to point to the question that that isn't necessary? Now, of course, you can't approach that question if you've decided it already by prejudice. So if somebody says, well, I think science should be devoted to finding natural causes for everything, well, that's okay. You can go continue with that, but then you're not part of this dialogue. You're not answering the question that the culture, that the public wants to put on the table. Putting aside all prejudice, putting aside preferences, what does the evidence show? Well, now, as you know from such basic science classes as you've had, the accepted orthodox wisdom of our time is that life began when some very primitive living organism, some very simple form of life, emerged by chemical combination from a prebiotic soup of chemicals, and then it grew to its present diversity and complexity by a process of random mutation and natural selection, the Darwinian mechanism, and that's how it happened, and that's what's taught as fact in the textbooks and the museum walls and the television programs. You'll have an 8-part series coming this fall from PBS, which will do its biggest effort to make sure that everybody gets convinced of exactly that story. Now, how do people know that this is true? Why do they think it is true? Well, the analysis that we've given is that it appears that the actual foundation for this story of Darwinian creation through biology is philosophical rather than experimental. And hence to say that it comes from science is somewhat misleading. In fact, experimental evidence does not exist to validate the hypothesis that non-living chemicals can come together on their own and form a living organism. The experiments end in failure. And you can find all sorts of quotations in the biological literature for that. Now, it's true that when you ask people in that scientific field how things are going, they answer, well, we're very encouraged, and we think success is just around the corner. And that's what's been being said for 50 years, and of course that's what people in a field always say when they know that the consequence of a negative answer is that their funding is all going to be withdrawn. So it's all promise, but the actual experimental validation isn't there. And indeed, the most impressive experiment ever done in this field was done in 1952. So it's not a dynamic field that's moving forward terribly fast. Now, many people will admit that, many people in the scientific field, but they will say, well, from that point on, it's true that that's a gap. But once we get life kick-started, then we've got it made from there, because Darwin, in principle, a century and a half ago, showed how all you need is a combination of inheritable random variations plus the survival of the fittest, the tendency of the superior reproducers to outbreed the inferior ones, and you can get all the way from the simple to the complex. Well, and yet we see that if you ask for experimental evidence of this doctrine, you have a hard time coming up with anything impressive. You know, for many years, the leading example in the textbooks was the peppered moth case, the population of peppered moths in the Midlands of England that was predominantly light-colored before the Industrial Revolution, because the light-colored moths were better camouflaged against the trees than the dark-colored moths, so there was a minority of dark-colored moths. But then air pollution darkened the trees, and so the birds could see the light-colored moths better and ate them in great numbers, and then dark moths predominated on the trees as the tree trunks were dark-colored. And later, when air pollution laws were kicked in, the population went back to normal because the trees were, the light-colored moths were better camouflaged against the trees. And this has been used for generations as the leading example of what natural selection can do. It doesn't involve any creation. It doesn't involve any new organs. It doesn't involve any permanent change at all in any creature or even in the population. No new features appear. And moreover, we now discover, rather late in the game, something that specialists have known all along, which appears that the moths don't sit on tree trunks anyway. And you can read about this in a book by my colleague Jonathan Wells, Icons of Evolution, in which he goes through the standard textbook examples and shows, this is one example of many, where totally inadequate, even on its own terms, and misleading and really unscientific evidence has been used to validate this basic story. If you look at the actual evidence of what natural selection has ever been seen to do, as opposed to the claims that have been made for it, you see that what you get, what all of the examples show, is that you do get population variations, which tend to be temporary. They're cyclical. You have more light-colored moths one time, more dark-colored moths at another. But none of the classic proofs show any innovation whatsoever. Nothing new is appearing. Yet they are accepted as evidence that this is a creative process of great power. And in many other ways, we see inadequacies of the evidence. And this causes us to raise the question, is it possible, indeed, is it perhaps probable, that this lackadaisical attitude towards evidence, the willingness to accept clearly inadequate proofs as a demonstration of the truth of the theory, and then the presenting of the theory dogmatically, has much more to do with what the evolutionary scientists want to believe than what their data are telling them. You see, when you want to believe something badly enough, it's natural to set the bar rather low for standards of proof to prove that it's true. And so we've offered the suggestion that perhaps the great desire of the evolutionary science community to establish a naturalistic mechanism to explain the history of life explains both their tolerance of otherwise very unsatisfactory evidence, their characterization of it as proof, and their ferocious aggressiveness in defending the theory from criticism. Their insistence that critics not be given a hearing, which is in itself another unscientific practice. So that is a question that we have raised. And I think the basic arguments that are used against us is again, you aren't allowed to do that. I say that you can propose an additional naturalistic solution if you want, but simply to make negative criticisms that discredit our theory is not allowed in science. Now, beyond that, we have attempted to make, I think, a systematic case, a positive case, that in fact President Clinton and Dr. Collins had it right, and say that there actually are intelligent causes operating in biology. And this has two main doctrines. Well, if you try to give an adequate explanation of this whole subject, obviously we'd be here all night. But I give you the short and sweet explanation so we can get to the question period. There are two doctrines which we assert are fully worthy of unbiased consideration in the scientific community. That's all we need to assert. So is that they should get unbiased consideration. We don't have to insist that you believe that they're true on a first hearing. The first is that the Darwinian theory and mechanism requires that there be a step-by-step process that continually is capable of producing new complex organs, things like wings and eyes and brains and so on. And that this is done by a combination of random genetic variation plus the blind, purposeless process of natural selection. And indeed, natural selection isn't selection at all. That's one of the misleading things about it. It's merely a misleading term which is used to describe the fact that some organisms outbreed others. Some have more children than others. You're not more fit because you can play Mozart on the piano or solve differential equations or whatever. The fittest people here are the ones who have left the most offspring, viable offspring. And so my colleague Michael Behe, who I'll be quoting in just a moment, likes to point out how much more fit than Richard Dawkins he is, because Dawkins has no children, and he has 8 children, all homeschooled. Natural selection is just merely describing the fact that somebody who leaves 8 copies of their genes is going to be predominate in the population that follows more frequently than somebody that leaves none, and hence actually goes out of the gene pool. Now, so this means there must be a step-by-step process that you can produce a new organ step by tiny step at a time by steps which are individually adaptively advantageous. You see, do you see why that is? Because each step will not be preserved by natural selection unless it contributes to reproductive fitness in the sense I've just described right now. Natural selection can't say, well, this is a nice new idea, that this gives us a little part here, and if we got some other things that came along later, we could put them all together and we'd have something to do something. That would be a conscious planning agent. So it is significant that, in fact, the evidence of molecular biology, biochemistry, is that at the level of the genes, of the enzymes and the proteins and the molecules, down where the action, the cutting edge of biology and the research grants are, there is a pervasive pattern of irreducible complexity. Things are enormously more complex than they were understood to be in Darwin's day, when the cell was thought to be just a blob of jelly-like substance, protoplasm, that could easily emerge from, a chemical broth. Now we know that the cell is a miniature chemical factory, almost analogous to a city, with its fire and police departments and hospitals and rescue operations and factories and so on. It's just like Washington, you see, all coordinated by a mastermind who makes everything work in perfect harmony. No, I guess the analogy breaks down there. But that's what the cell is like. And as my colleague Michael Behe showed in his book, Darwin's Black Box, again and again you see patterns in which it appears that the molecules are, that you have to have a lot of complex parts for anything to work. And unless you have all the parts at once, no individual part does any good. Sort of think of it like putting together a radio from a kit. You put together the first 100 parts or so and you've got nothing. It doesn't work. So you keep on going only because you think that if, you finish the whole job, you'll have a radio that works. Probably you're wrong, but you are a conscious, planning, purposeful agent, however misguided, and so you can follow a distant goal that way. Natural selection can't do that. Now, you see, something like this does not operate as an absolute knockdown, conclusive proof that you can't get it that way, because there are always dodges you can make, always ad hoc adjustments you can make to the theory. And Darwinists do this. They'll say, well, we can't see what any one of these parts would have done individually, but maybe they did something else. They were useful for some other purpose we don't know, and so they were hanging around, you see, each of them when they could get co-opted for this new function. But when you have to do that again and again and again a few hundred times, it becomes pretty clear that what we're engaging in is a process of unfounded speculation rather than a process of explaining something that's been confirmed experimentally. So irreducible complexity in the cell is, charge number 1 in our indictment. And the second is that, in fact, the important thing to understand about living organisms is not the chemicals that they're made of, but rather the information that directs and coordinates the activities of the cell. So in my example of the cell that is like a city with all of those operations, clearly there is a need for a coordinating program of some kind, of a complexity and a mastery that makes human computer programs that, Windows 98 that's crashing all the time, in your desk, look rather low-tech in comparison. So this is not even controversial. Richard Dawkins, the world's most prominent Darwinist, likes to say, to concede that the cell must contain a program with more instructions, which is more complex than all the volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica put together. Now, you see, to him, it's an article of faith. It follows philosophically that however much complexity, however much information is there, must have come from the Darwinian process because it's the only thing that could have happened. And if you're satisfied with that, well, okay, then there you are. But that's philosophical doctrine. That's philosophical dogmatism. That's not open-minded experimental scientific investigation. And in fact, there is no process known to biology which is information creating in any basic way. And remember, we're not talking about creating one bit of information, but all those volumes of the encyclopedia, altogether. So unless one can identify and experimentally test and confirm the existence of an information creating process, the kind that can write encyclopedias or computer programs, then we really just don't have a candidate. And you can also see that this is not a matter of the process not having enough time. What we're talking about here is a process that never gets started on the crucial job. So it doesn't matter how much time you have. Now, again, I want to emphasize that in my mind, at least, this argument is not meant as an incontrovertible proof. It's meant as a challenge. I believe it leads to a very firm conclusion, but I could be wrong. So it is open to the scientific community to show that there is this information-creating mechanism that can be tested. That's their job as a scientist. But it's quite another matter if they say, as Richard Dawkins does, well, it simply must be true on philosophical grounds. We don't need evidence. Say, I know at that point I'm not dealing with biologists. I'm dealing with metaphysicians. And so having seen that experience so many times, I conclude that the biologists believe in Darwinian evolution not because of what they know as biologists, but in spite of what they know as biologists, because it's this philosophy that dominates the field. And, of course, I hope I've convinced you with my opening anecdote about President Clinton at that press conference that the question of whether or not there's a creator is not a question that the public either will or should leave to the unbounded discretion of professional biologists. I'll say that just isn't within their domain to decide. It isn't within their domain to decide that only nature can do the creating. Those are philosophical questions. And insofar as they claim an authority to decide them, it's an illegitimate authority. Well, now, our effort in making the questions this way has been to state questions in a way that they could become eligible for consideration in the secular academic world. They sort of follow on that press conference as the kinds of things that ought to be being discussed by the professors and reported by the reporters and explored on programs on, PBS, for example, which instead gives you, just steady propaganda treatments of the party line. So it's a discussion that needs to be held because it's healthy for a society to have ways for controversial questions to be debated on intellectual grounds rather than just to be the occasion for mudslinging and stone throwing. And that's a real job of intellectuals. That's the job we're trying to do, to open up the subject by giving people categories that make it possible to think about them and to evaluate evidence. Another thing that we have wanted to do in the intelligent design movement is to state the question in a way that tends to unify the religious world, that tends to state a question that's not just dividing the religious people against each other. If you get into questions about the book of Genesis and the Genesis chronology and so on, so you just set off a war everywhere. And so we want to just start with the most basic question. The one that everybody wants to know, that everybody's concerned with from every religious tradition. Is there a creator or isn't there? Is that a pre-scientific myth? See, that a purposeful creator brought about the world? Or is it in fact consistent with and supported by the best scientific knowledge, as many people seem to think? We're not saying that anybody has to accept our preferred answer or any answer to this, but we are saying that the very most basic presuppositions of a free society under a constitution like ours is that it should be possible to get a fair consideration of that question. And up till now, it has not been possible. Well, now, this job of attempting to redefine the subject so that it can be discussed rationally in a civilized forum has been going on for a decade. I formulated this strategy for presenting the question back in the early 90s, and with the idea that the objective for the first decade would be to get the question on the table, to make it a legitimate subject of public debate in the particularly in the academic world and in the media world, where previously it had been just a stereotype debate. You know, it's Bible thumpers versus reasonable scientists. Now, you know, who's right? But rather to make it a sensible and rational debate. And when I started out with this, I formulated a very definite idea of what would constitute success. You know, you have to have some way to measure whether you're getting anywhere or not. And I told all of my companions and the people that got started in this that I would know we had achieved the initial objective if we got a story in the New York Times on us done by the science desk. You say that now that's important. It can't be done by the religion desk. You know, new fashion in religious kookery. I mean, that wouldn't do. On the other hand, if it's done by the science desk and presented as a serious issue, it doesn't really matter whether the story is favorable or not. You see, that's not the requirement. It just has to be that they say this is going on and there's this public debate. That's the kind of thing. And there are many, you know, other ways. It wouldn't have to be necessarily that publication, but that would be the kind of thing that would show that we were beginning to. We could say we had achieved the first stage of the objective. So you can imagine my delight when on April 8th of this year, I knew that there had been a story in the making for some time, but I was looking forward to it, and I was hoping that it would appear one of the Tuesdays when they have the Tuesday Science page. But I was stunned to get up on Sunday morning, April 8th, and find that the story appeared in the Sunday paper and on the front page, and that it was favorable. My cup runneth over. I could not, sort of believe it. And moreover, this had been after 2 weeks before we had a front page story in the Los Angeles Times. Okay, so the objective was, and there have been other stories in the paper that are good stories. Now, when you speak of say a story is favorable, what I mean by that is a favorable story is one that takes you seriously and presents a fair description of what you're trying to say, doesn't trash you, doesn't ridicule you, sort of, or whatever. They quote the other side that says, these people are full of baloney and all of that. And that's perfectly fair. That's, journalistic practice. But in this case, to add more, running over to my cup, the Times reporter phoned the president of the National Academy of Sciences and asked him why the fraudulent evidence exposed in the book Icons of Evolution was still in his textbook. Namely, the embryo drawings of embryos. You've seen them in textbook. If you've taken any biology course, you've seen these. They'll be like a chicken, a dog, and a pig or something like that. And they all look like a cashew, and they're just identical. They're fraudulent. They've been known to be by the experts for a long time. It gets rediscovered from time to time. They're still in all the textbooks. The embryos don't look like that at all. There is some similarity, but they're all of different sizes and shapes and so on. It's just a rough similarity. And they also develop to that point by entirely different means. You see, it's a midpoint, not the beginning point, as it's supposed to be in the illustration. So, this was just amazing that to that degree of skepticism had come. And now, the reason why I think we were really beginning to get somewhere with the reporters who spent a lot of time trying to get the story right. These are really hardworking, decent people. They didn't start out with any idea to do us a favor, but just wanted to do a professional job. The Los Angeles Times reporter, in particular, worked just for hours to be sure she understood the issues right. But the Los Angeles Times reporter was the religion reporter, so, that's not quite as good for us. But what was really good about her piece was that she focused on the story of a friend of ours, a high school teacher in the state of Washington, who is attempting to teach his students that there is a controversy over evolution. So he teaches the mainstream view, but he also teaches why it's controversial. And they got along doing that for years. He's a very popular teacher, but then one year he had the president of the local atheist association, had his son there or whatever, and started bringing lawsuits. And now they have community demonstrations, about all of this. And they put ads in papers demanding that he be fired and so on. Now, this is the Scopes trial in reverse. This is the courageous teacher who is trying to teach his students not some dogma, not some religious dogma. He's not reading the book of Genesis. He's trying to teach them that this is a controversy in the public and that some reasonable people have their doubts, and that's absolutely forbidden. The principal at the school told him he could not assign articles to the students by people such as Stephen Jay Gould. One of the loyalist Darwinists, because they contained information that might cause the students to doubt what is in the textbook. That's what we call science. And say, once the reporters begin to see that we are on the side of the people who are trying to raise an issue, trying to get a fair hearing, we're on the First Amendment side of the issue, the freedom of speech, side of the issue. You see, then that makes for a big breakthrough, because it helps them to get over what they've been taught all their lives, which is that religion means about the same thing as dogmatism and oppression. You see, and science means, fair-minded evaluation of the evidence. Well, this is, to put it mildly, an oversimplification. So we now have many members of the press beginning to see you have people who are trying to raise a serious intellectual issue here in a responsible manner, put it before the university and scientific community, and demand only fair treatment, a level playing field, a chance for all the considerations to come out. And it is the elite scientific leadership and university leadership that will not allow it. You see, that says if we say it, it's so. And people who want to read something else are thought criminals of some kind, and we'll cover them with ridicule and abuse and so on. So that picture is beginning to get through. And that is why we felt that we could title the lecture tonight, The Coming Intellectual Breakthrough. Now, this issue is going to break out in the open. I am dedicated to the view that there is a creator, and that the evidence of science reports that. I'm quite convinced of that after having studied it. But I'm every bit as much dedicated to the view that controversial public issues should be argued in open forums on an honest basis, a level playing field, and we should all live with the consequences of a public debate. So I'm perfectly willing to lose if that should be the outcome of these proceedings. But I'm not worried for a moment. You see, and the reason I'm not worried for a moment, because I know, anybody with experience in lawsuits and controversies and so on knows that when one side wants an open investigation of the evidence without philosophical rules and boundaries to prevent open-minded consideration, and the other side says we couldn't possibly allow that, the side that couldn't possibly allow it can't possibly allow it. That they're right, you see, which is to say they cannot prevail. Their system will necessarily collapse once the bright light of analysis and fair-minded consideration is shown on it. But you don't have to take my word for that. Just wait. You'll see soon enough. It's a really exciting process. It's a wonderful country. It's a wonderful constitutional system we live in. We have, great freedoms, but they're always under threat from something. There's always something that's off limits. There's always some standard of political correctness or, dogmatism that can't be challenged. And it's our job as citizens in every generation, to work against those things, to open up the consideration, because one of the things that I believe very fervently is that given a fair chance, the truth will speak for itself. We do not have to impose truth on people with dogmas, with authoritarian measures. We can trust the people. We can trust the jury. We can trust the population, after many difficulties and wrong turns, to come through to the right end if they are given an opportunity to hear all the considerations, to have prolonged and extended debate, and to have the errors corrected in that process of open debate. That's the right way to decide things. And that's the coming intellectual breakthrough. I think it's going to be the most exciting intellectual development of my life and of our times, and I think it's going to have an enormous effect on the life of the mind in every area. It's a wonderful time for the young people here to be going into their adulthood, to have the problems and opportunities that will arise from this. So thank you all for coming and listening, and now we'll go to the question period. 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 The question period.